In the dark tapestry of human history, few figures cast as long or as terrible a shadow as Adolf Hitler. The architect of the Third Reich and perpetrator of the Holocaust, Hitler's name has become synonymous with evil. Yet he was born a human child in ordinary circumstances to unremarkable parents. How does a failed artist from a small Austrian town transform into a dictator who plunges the world into the deadliest conflict in human history? What forces, both within himself and in the world around him, created the monster who would orchestrate the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed unworthy of life? To understand Hitler is not to excuse him, but by examining the path that led from a troubled child to the most reviled figure of the 20th century, we may recognize the warning signs when similar figures emerge. For tyranny rarely announces itself. It creeps in through the cracks of broken societies, exploiting fear and promising salvation. In this documentary, we will trace Hitler's life from his birth in 1889 to his suicide in the ruins of Berlin in 1945. We'll explore the personal traumas and historical circumstances that shaped him. The strict father, the doting mother, the failures and rejections, the trenches of World War I, and the humiliation of Germany's defeat. On a spring day in 1889, in the small border town of Braunau am Inn, Austria, Clara Hitler gave birth to her fourth child. 3 previous children had died in infancy, so when this boy survived, she lavished him with attention and care. She named him Adolf. The Hitler household was not a happy one. Alois Hitler, Adolf's father, was a strict customs official who ruled his family with an iron fist. Already 51 years old when Adolf was born, Alois had worked his way up from illegitimate peasant child to respectable civil servant, and he expected similar discipline and achievement from his children. Alois Hitler embodied the harshness of 19th century Austrian patriarchy. Contemporaries described him as authoritarian, quick-tempered, and often intoxicated. He would regularly beat young Adolf, sometimes to the point where neighbors feared for the boy's life. Against this backdrop of paternal terror stood Clara, described by those who knew her as gentle, hard-working, and devoted to her children. Only 29 when Adolf was born, she had been Alois's housekeeper before becoming his third wife. Adolf would later describe her as the only person he truly loved. The contrast between parents couldn't have been starker. A domineering, abusive father and a nurturing, perhaps overprotective mother. This dynamic is something we see repeatedly in Adolf's later relationships with both men and women. The Hitler family moved frequently due to Alois's career, eventually settling in Leonding near Linz. It was here, in 1895, that 6-year-old Adolf began school. Initially a good student, he gradually lost interest in formal education, preferring to daydream about becoming an artist. In 1900, tragedy struck the Hitler household when Adolf's younger brother Edmund died of measles. The loss devastated 11-year-old Adolf and compounded the growing darkness in his psyche. Death was a constant shadow in Hitler's childhood. 3 siblings had died before he was born, and now Edmund's death likely intensified both his mother's protective instincts and Adolf's own sense of specialness as a survivor. The most significant rupture came on January 3, 1903, when Alois Hitler collapsed and died from a lung hemorrhage. Adolf, now 13, would later claim this as a turning point. Freedom from his father's tyranny allowed his true self to emerge. With Alois gone, Adolf's behavior changed dramatically. He became rebellious, his grades plummeted, and he began constructing elaborate fantasies about his future greatness. The teachers at his school in Linz described him as argumentative and thinking himself always in the right. These teenage years revealed 2 passions that would define Hitler's future: German nationalism and art. Though living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a multinational state, young Adolf became obsessed with German culture and history, particularly the mythology of Germanic heroes. Hitler said in his youth, "My history teacher, Dr. Leopold Putsch, had much to do with my becoming a nationalist. He used our national history to teach us the glory of German achievement. When he spoke of Germany's greatness, his eyes would fill with tears. Simultaneously, Hitler dreamed of becoming an artist. He filled sketchbooks with drawings of buildings and landscapes, showing technical competence but little originality. His mother, perhaps hoping to spare him his father's harsh discipline, indulged these artistic ambitions. But another tragedy would shatter the fragile peace of Hitler's adolescence. In 1907, when Adolf was 18, Clara developed breast cancer. The family doctor, Eduard Bloch, who was Jewish, treated her with iodoform, an experimental treatment that caused tremendous pain. Hitler witnessed his mother's suffering up close. He was devoted to her throughout her illness, even cooking and cleaning while she deteriorated. Bloch later recalled that he had never seen anyone so overcome with grief as young Adolf when Clara died on December 21, 1907. Orphaned at 18, with few practical skills and little formal education, Hitler now faced the world alone. The death of his mother coincided with another crushing blow: his rejection from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, where examiners found his drawings technically accurate but lacking in understanding of the human form. The rejection was devastating to Hitler, who had built his identity around becoming an artist. Interestingly, the Academy suggested he apply to architecture school instead, noting his talent for buildings. But this would have required additional schooling Hitler lacked the qualifications for. In February 1908, with his orphan's inheritance rapidly dwindling, Hitler moved to Vienna. He would later describe these years as a time of misery and woe that forged his worldview. The once imperial capital was a crucible of modernism, political extremism, and ethnic tension, a perfect storm that would transform a troubled orphan into a budding demagogue. Vienna in 1908 was a city of stark contrasts. The magnificent Ringstrasse showcased the Habsburg Empire's imperial grandeur, while in overcrowded tenements, masses of workers and immigrants struggled to survive. Into this divided world stepped the 18-year-old Adolf Hitler, carrying little more than a suitcase of clothes and his artistic aspirations. Hitler's love for Wagner wasn't just aesthetic, it was ideological. Wagner's anti-Semitic writings and German nationalist themes provided Hitler with a cultural framework for his developing worldview. As his funds dwindled, Hitler's situation grew desperate. Rejected again by the Academy of Fine Arts in 1908, he refused to seek regular employment, considering it beneath him. By 1909, he was living in a men's hostel, occasionally selling hand-painted postcards of Vienna landmarks to tourists. The disconnect between Hitler's grandiose self-image and his actual circumstances created intense psychological pressure. He began to seek explanations for his failures that placed blame elsewhere, a pattern that would define his political thinking. Vienna in this era was an incubator for radical politics. Anti-Semitism was particularly virulent, championed by politicians like Karl Lueger, the city's mayor, who used Jewish conspiracy theories to rally support among Christians fearful of modernization and economic change. Hitler arrived in Vienna with conventional prejudices against Jews, but not the eliminationist hatred he would later espouse. In Mein Kampf, he claims his anti-Semitism crystallized in Vienna, though he likely exaggerated this transformation for narrative effect. Hitler absorbed these ideas in Vienna's coffeehouses and from cheap pamphlets. He was particularly influenced by racial theorists like Guido von List and Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, who combined pseudo-scientific racism with occult Germanic mythology. What made Hitler dangerous wasn't that his ideas were original. They weren't. It was his ability to synthesize the floating prejudices of his time into a coherent worldview that explained both personal and national grievances through the lens of racial struggle. During these Vienna years, Hitler also developed a passionate German nationalism, despite being an Austrian citizen. He followed pan-German movements that advocated uniting all German-speaking peoples into one nation. Hitler writes, "My youthful enthusiasm for the Habsburg state was replaced by deep hatred. The more I understood the outer policy of the Habsburg monarchy, the more my rejection of this mixing of races grew." This period also brought Hitler into contact with Marxism and organized labor movements, which he came to despise. He viewed class struggle as undermining national unity, or communism as a Jewish conspiracy. Hitler's anti-communism was inextricably linked to his anti-Semitism. He constructed a worldview where Jews simultaneously controlled international finance capitalism and revolutionary Marxism, a contradiction he never resolved. By 1913, Hitler's Vienna period was drawing to a close. Facing conscription into the Habsburg army, a prospect he dreaded, he fled to Munich, Germany in May. He later claimed this move was motivated by political principle. Documents suggest he was avoiding Austrian military service. Hitler arrived in Munich as a nobody, a failed artist dodging military service. None who encountered him could have imagined his future role. This should give us pause about our ability to identify future threats to democracy. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Hitler found his first true purpose. Photographs show him in Munich's Odeonsplatz, ecstatically celebrating the declaration of war, a moment he would later describe as the greatest and most unforgettable time of my earthly existence. The war offered Hitler everything he lacked: community, purpose, structure, and a channel for his anger. For perhaps the first time in his life, his personal desires aligned perfectly with a larger movement. Hitler enlisted in a Bavarian regiment, serving as a dispatch runner on the Western Front. His war service was characterized by bravery. He received the Iron Cross twice, but also by his peculiar isolation from his fellow soldiers, who found him intense and standoffish. Hitler spent his free time reading or arguing politics, while the rest of us played cards or talked about girls. There was something not quite normal about his intensity. He seemed to have no interest in anything but the war and Germany's destiny. In October 1918, Hitler was temporarily blinded in a British gas attack and sent to a military hospital in Passewalk, Germany. It was there, recovering his sight, that he heard news of Germany's surrender and the Kaiser's abdication. Hitler writes, "Everything went black before my eyes. I tottered and groped my way back to the dormitory, threw myself on my bunk, and buried my burning head in the blanket and pillow. So it had all been in vain. In vain all the sacrifices and privations. In vain the hours in which we gritted our teeth. In vain the death of 2 million. This myth of personal revelation would become central to Hitler's political narrative, the moment when his mission to save Germany crystallized. While likely dramatized for effect, this experience of defeat profoundly shaped his thinking. War's end created cognitive dissonance for Hitler. He had finally found belonging and purpose, only to face defeat he couldn't accept. The stab in the back myth that Germany was betrayed by Jews and communists rather than defeated militarily resolved this dissonance. As Hitler left the hospital and returned to a Munich in revolutionary chaos, he carried with him the psychological seeds of what would become Nazism. A toxic blend of anti-Semitism, German nationalism, social Darwinism, and a messianic sense of personal destiny. The shy, awkward artist who had roamed Vienna's streets was gone. In his place stood a hardened veteran with a mission: to reverse Germany's defeat and purge it of those he blamed. The stage was set for his entry into politics. The Germany to which Hitler returned after World War I was unrecognizable from the powerful empire he had fought for. Kaiser had abdicated. Revolutionaries battled in the streets, and the humiliating terms of the Versailles Treaty imposed crushing reparations payments while stripping Germany of territory and military power. In Munich, Hitler remained in the army, which used him as an education officer to counter communist influence among troops. This role led to his first encounter with politics, when he was assigned to investigate a small group called the German Workers' Party in September 1919. The German Workers' Party had fewer than 60 members when Hitler attended his first meeting. It was one of dozens of fringe nationalist groups in Munich. Nothing marked it for greatness except the accident of Hitler's assignment to monitor it. During the meeting, Hitler found himself responding passionately to a speaker who advocated Bavaria breaking away from Germany. His impromptu speech so impressed Anton Drexler, the party's founder, that Hitler was invited to join. Hitler's decision to join the German Workers' Party was pivotal. It provided him with a platform, however tiny, and people who recognized his oratorical talents. For perhaps the first time, someone saw value in Hitler's abilities. Hitler quickly became the party's propaganda chief and worked to expand its reach. He insisted on larger venues for meetings, designed striking red posters to attract attention, and orchestrated the theatrical aspects of rallies, including dramatic entrances and martial music. By February 1920, Hitler helped craft the party's 25-point program and rename it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. The program blended nationalist, socialist, and anti-Semitic ideas, calling for the unification of all Germans, the revocation of the Versailles Treaty, and the removal of citizenship rights for Jews. The genius of the Nazi program was its appeal to multiple constituencies. Nationalists angry about Versailles, workers suffering from inflation, middle-class Germans fearful of communism, and anti-Semites seeking scapegoats. Each could find something appealing. Hitler's oratorical style developed during these early years. He discovered his ability to channel the audience's frustrations and hatreds, starting quietly and building to an emotional crescendo that left listeners exhilarated. When Hitler spoke, it was as if he was giving voice to our innermost thoughts. He articulated the anger and humiliation we all felt but couldn't express. By the end, I found myself on my feet, shouting approval without even realizing I had stood up. As Hitler's prominence grew, he attracted the attention of wealthy supporters, including Ernst Röhm, who connected him with the Freikorps, paramilitary groups of former soldiers. From these groups came the Nazi Party's enforcement arm, the Sturmabteilung or SA, the Brown Shirts. By July 1921, Hitler had outmaneuvered the party's original leadership to become chairman with dictatorial powers, a position he would never relinquish. His absolute control of the party prefigured his later approach to governing Germany. Hitler's takeover of the Nazi Party established a pattern: initial cooperation, followed by consolidation of power, elimination of rivals, and the creation of a leadership cult. We would see this pattern repeated on a national scale a decade later. The economic crisis gripping Germany intensified Hitler's appeal. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed middle-class savings, with prices doubling every few days. Workers carried wages home in wheelbarrows, and children played with blocks of worthless currency. The psychological trauma of hyperinflation cannot be overstated. People who had played by society's rules, saving, working hard, saw their life's work evaporate. This created a profound distrust of democratic institutions and a yearning for authoritarian solutions. Inspired by Mussolini's successful march on Rome the previous year, Hitler decided the time was ripe for seizing power. On November 8, 1923, he and 2,000 Nazi stormtroopers stormed a beer hall in Munich, where Bavarian officials were speaking, announcing the start of a national revolution. The coup attempt, known as the beer hall putsch, collapsed the next day when police opened fire on Nazi marchers, killing 16. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. The putsch was a tactical failure, but a strategic success. It transformed Hitler from a local political figure to a national one, and gave him a platform during his trial to broadcast his ideas across Germany. At his trial in 1924, Hitler turned the tables on his accusers, using the proceedings to attack the Weimar Republic and defend his actions as patriotic. The sympathetic judges sentenced him to just 5 years in prison, with eligibility for early parole. In one of his speeches, Hitler says, "The man who is born to be a dictator is not compelled, he wills it. He is not driven forward, but drives himself. A man who feels called upon to govern a people has no right to say, 'If you want me or summon me, I will cooperate.' No, it is his duty to step forward." Hitler served just 9 months in Landsberg prison, where he was treated as a celebrity prisoner with a private room and unlimited visitors. It was here that he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, to his loyal follower Rudolf Hess, a rambling autobiography and political manifesto that laid out his worldview. Mein Kampf is a disturbing window into Hitler's mind. It clearly articulates his anti-Semitism, belief in racial struggle, and plans for German expansion. The tragedy is that so few took these stated intentions seriously until it was too late. Upon his release in December 1924, Hitler found a changed political landscape. The economy had stabilized, and the Nazi Party had splintered in his absence. He would need to rebuild it and find a new path to power. Hitler reorganized the Nazi Party on a more hierarchical model, creating a national network and a personal political machine. Crucially, he decided to pursue power through electoral means rather than revolution, though he never abandoned violence as a tactic. Hitler's legality strategy was cynical but effective. He would use democracy to destroy democracy, exploiting its freedoms while never believing in its principles. Through the mid-1920s, the Nazi Party remained a minor political force. In the 1928 elections, it received just 2.6% of the vote, but Hitler used this time to build party infrastructure, create the elite SS security force under Heinrich Himmler, and cultivate wealthy backers like industrial magnate Fritz Thyssen. Everything changed with the Wall Street crash of October 1929. As American loans dried up, the German economy collapsed again. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, nearly 1 in 3 workers. Economic catastrophe radicalized the German electorate. Moderate center hollowed out as voters fled to extremes, communists on the left and Nazis on the right. Democracy became associated with failure and suffering. In this climate of desperation, Hitler's promises of national renewal found receptive ears. Nazi electoral support exploded from 2.6% in 1928 to 37.4% in July 1932, making them the largest party in the Reichstag. The Nazi rallies were like religious experiences: torchlight, music, thousands of voices shouting in unison. Hitler spoke of Germany rising like a phoenix from the ashes. After years of humiliation, it was intoxicating to feel proud again. Despite their electoral success, the Nazis never won an outright majority. Hitler's path to power ultimately came through backroom deals with conservative elites who believed they could control him while using his popular support. After months of political maneuvering and 2 more elections, the elderly President Paul von Hindenburg reluctantly appointed Hitler as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, as part of a coalition government in which Nazis held only 3 cabinet posts. Those who engineered Hitler's appointment catastrophically underestimated him. Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen famously remarked, "We've hired him," implying Hitler would be controlled. Within months, it was clear who was really in charge. Hitler's supporters celebrated his appointment with a massive torchlight parade through Berlin. As the Nazi columns passed through the Brandenburg Gate, a perceptive observer might have noticed that German democracy was marching out as they marched in. In just 14 years, Hitler had gone from obscure veteran to leader of Germany, but his true aim was not to govern within the constraints of democracy. It was to destroy those constraints entirely and reshape Germany according to his racial vision. The stage was now set for the transformation of the German state and the horrors that would follow. When Hitler took the oath as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, few, even among his supporters, could imagine the speed with which Germany would transform from a flawed democracy into a one-party dictatorship. The process would take less than 6 months. Hitler's first cabinet meeting established his priorities: new elections, to be held under conditions favorable to the Nazis. But before the campaign could begin, a pivotal event provided Hitler with the pretext for emergency powers. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building, Germany's parliament, erupted in flames. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was caught at the scene. While historians still debate whether the Nazis orchestrated the fire, what's undeniable is how expertly Hitler exploited it. The morning after the fire, Hitler persuaded President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended civil liberties indefinitely. Overnight, constitutional protections vanished. Thousands of Communist Party members and other opponents were arrested. The Reichstag Fire Decree was the legal death of the Weimar Republic. It gave authorities power to detain people without trial, search homes without warrants, and suppress publications. Most Germans accepted these measures as necessary for security. The March 5th elections, held in this atmosphere of fear and propaganda, gave the Nazi Party 44% of the vote, still short of a majority. Hitler needed one more step to secure absolute power: the Enabling Act, which would allow him to pass laws without parliamentary approval. To pass this act required a 2/3 majority of the Reichstag. Hitler ensured this by barring communist deputies and intimidating the Catholic Center Party into compliance. On March 23, 1933, democracy voted itself out of existence as the Enabling Act passed 444 to 94, with only the Social Democrats voting against. When Hitler rose to speak before the vote, he promised to use his powers moderately and preserve Christianity as the foundation of German life. These were calculated lies. The Enabling Act was designed to make him dictator in all but name. With these new powers, Hitler moved swiftly. By July 1933, all political parties except the Nazis were banned, labor unions were dissolved, and replaced with the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front. The free press disappeared, as newspapers were either shut down or purchased by Nazi supporters. Even within the Nazi movement, Hitler eliminated potential rivals. During the Night of the Long Knives, June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, Hitler ordered the murder of SA leader Ernst Röhm and dozens of others who threatened his control. The purge of the SA served multiple purposes. It eliminated Röhm, who advocated a second revolution with socialist elements. It appeased the army, which feared the SA as a rival, and it demonstrated that Hitler stood above even his oldest allies. When President Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934, Hitler abolished the presidency and declared himself Führer leader of the German Reich, combining the powers of Chancellor and President. The army swore a personal oath of loyalty not to Germany or its constitution, but to Hitler himself. The personal oath was a masterstroke that bound the German officer corps to Hitler rather than to the state. Even officers who came to oppose Hitler's policies felt constrained by this oath, with tragic consequences during the war. The Nazi regime penetrated every aspect of German life. Children joined the Hitler Youth or the League of German Girls. Workers participated in the Strength Through Joy program, which provided vacations and leisure activities while indoctrinating them in Nazi ideology. The Nazis created a national community, Volksgemeinschaft, that was simultaneously inclusive and exclusive. It offered belonging to racial Germans, while systematically excluding those deemed outside the community, particularly Jews. The persecution of Jews began immediately upon Hitler's assumption of power. The April 1st, 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses was followed by the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935, which stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. The path to the Holocaust was incremental. Each step normalized anti-Semitism further and isolated Jews from the protection of their fellow citizens. When deportations began years later, German society had been prepared to accept, or at least not actively resist, the unthinkable. As Hitler consolidated power domestically, he turned to foreign policy. His aims, clearly outlined in Mein Kampf, included overturning the Versailles Treaty, rearming Germany, uniting all German-speaking peoples, and acquiring living space, Lebensraum, in Eastern Europe. In March 1935, Hitler publicly announced German rearmament, violating the Versailles Treaty. A year later, he sent troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, gambling correctly that France and Britain would not respond militarily. These early successes emboldened him. Each time Hitler violated the treaty and faced no consequences, his prestige at home grew and his contempt for Western leaders deepened. He called them little worms in private and was convinced they lacked the will to oppose him. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss and demanded the German-speaking Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. At the Munich conference in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier capitulated to these demands in exchange for Hitler's promise of peace in our time. Munich represents the high water mark of appeasement. Western leaders, haunted by the slaughter of World War I and facing publics adamantly opposed to another war, convinced themselves Hitler could be satisfied with limited territorial adjustments. In March 1939, Hitler broke his Munich pledges by occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia. This naked aggression finally convinced Britain and France to guarantee Poland's borders, setting the stage for World War II when Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Hitler didn't stumble into World War. He wanted it. He believed Germany needed to fight while he was still in his prime, and before potential enemies like the Soviet Union grew too strong. The timing of 1939 was strategic. The early war years seemed to vindicate Hitler's leadership. In a series of stunning victories, German forces conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. By summer 1940, Nazi flags flew from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. These triumphs cemented Hitler's godlike status among many Germans. His military judgment seemed infallible, and even skeptics were silenced by success. Yet behind the victories lurked the darkness of the Nazi racial vision. From the beginning, the war provided cover for implementing Hitler's racial policies. In conquered territories, especially in the east, SS Einsatzgruppen, special task forces, followed the regular army, murdering Jews, communists, and other undesirables in mass shootings. The invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, marked a fateful escalation both militarily and in the implementation of the Holocaust. Behind the front lines, the killing of Jews became systematic and industrial. Decision-making process that led to the final solution, the systematic murder of European Jews, remains contested by historians. What's clear is that by late 1941, the Nazi leadership had committed to total extermination rather than forced emigration or ghettoization. The Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942, coordinated the implementation of this genocide across Nazi-occupied Europe. Death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor were constructed with the sole purpose of murder on an industrial scale. They separated us on the platform, men from women, old from young. My mother and sister went left. Father and I went right. That decision meant life or death. Those who went left went straight to the gas chambers. I never saw my mother and sister again. By 1942, the military tide began to turn against Germany. The failure to capture Moscow, the entry of the United States into the war after Pearl Harbor, and the devastating defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Reich. Hitler's strategic mistakes multiplied as the war progressed. He refused to allow tactical retreats, divided his forces, and increasingly relied on wonder weapons that came too late to affect the outcome. His interference in military decisions often proved disastrous. As Allied bombing devastated German cities and Soviet forces pushed westward, Hitler retreated both physically and psychologically. By early 1945, he rarely left the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, issuing orders to armies that existed only on maps. Hitler's final months show a man in physical and mental decline, suffering from Parkinson's symptoms, sleeping during the day, and flying into uncontrollable rages. Yet his core beliefs never wavered. If anything, defeat reinforced his violent anti-Semitism. Even as Soviet artillery pounded Berlin in April 1945, Hitler continued to believe in final victory through non-existent armies or miracle weapons. On April 29th, he married his longtime companion Eva Braun in the bunker and dictated his political testament, a document that showed no remorse, only bitter accusations against those he blamed for Germany's defeat. Hitler says, "I have fought for 3 decades with all my strength against international Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. But if the German people are not willing to fight for their survival, then they deserve to perish. I leave behind no regret, only my lifelong love for the German people." On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Hitler shot himself while Eva Braun took poison. Following his instructions, aides carried their bodies to the garden, doused them with gasoline, and set them aflame. Hitler chose suicide rather than capture, denying the world the spectacle of a trial like those later held at Nuremberg for other Nazi leaders. His death, like much of his life, was choreographed for maximum mythological impact. Berlin fell to the Soviets on May 2nd, and Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th, 1945. Third Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, had collapsed after just 12. But the human cost was almost beyond comprehension. More than 70 million people died in World War II. 6 million Jews and millions of others, including Roma, disabled people, homosexuals, political prisoners, and Soviet POWs, were murdered in the Holocaust. Germany itself lay in ruins, divided and occupied. The striking aspect of Hitler's legacy is the disconnect between his territorial ambitions and their results. Rather than creating a greater Germany, he destroyed German unity for decades. Rather than establishing German dominance in Europe, he created the conditions for American and Soviet hegemony. In death as in life, Hitler left a complex legacy that continues to haunt our world. His rise demonstrates democracy's vulnerability to demagogues in times of economic and social crisis. His ideology shows how ancient prejudices can be weaponized through modern propaganda and technology. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson is how quickly civilized norms can collapse. Germany was not a backward nation, but one of the world's most educated and culturally sophisticated societies. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. His life trajectory, from unremarkable origins through alienation and radicalization to unprecedented crimes, continues to be studied for insights into the darkest possibilities of human behavior and politics. The Holocaust he orchestrated has become the paradigmatic genocide, a benchmark for evil against which other atrocities are measured. Never again became both a pledge and a warning for future generations. The lessons of history must never be forgotten. If this video helped you better understand the dark legacy of the Holocaust and Hitler's rise to power, please help us share this knowledge. Like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth historical documentaries. Remember, never again starts with remembrance.